Excellent. Look, thanks very much for having me, and thanks for choosing this topic. It's a topic that's dear to my heart because we often talk a lot in church about what we do in church, which is about 10% of our time, and we don't spend a lot of time talking about what we do for a far larger percentage of our time. So in our working hours, we do things for people. We do things to people. People do things to us. Work is highly relational. And if you think about where you work, it's probably the relationships at work that keep you motivated or maybe demotivated. So you've probably made friends at work. There's probably somebody at work who rubs you up the wrong way. You may at work be fixing brokenness. You may find your work to be particularly tedious and to the point of being absolutely soul destroying. Although if you enjoy your work, maybe your work is a bit addictive, and maybe the word workaholic might be true of you. Some of you might be working to gain your parents' approval, and that's why you've chosen that career. Or some of you might be choosing a career just to prove your parents wrong, and that's possible as well. Through work, we get lots of benefits. We provide for our families. We support the ministry of the gospel. In fact, it's hard to envisage a life without work. And certainly is at my stage of life, when several of my friends are retiring, I just really can't picture what life without work would look like. And a retirement that has no work in it is a problem as well. So the Bible talks heaps about work, and people are described very much by their jobs. So if we were in a room together, I'd go around the room and ask you about some people who are described by their jobs, but let me tell you some. Pilate is a governor. Nicodemus is a teacher of Israel. David has two professions. What are they? He's a shepherd and he's also a king. Nathan's a prophet. Lydia is a dealer in purple cloth. Joseph is a carpenter. But that's not all that they do. See, I work, and you might think my work is to be the principal of a theological college, and that's a part of what they do. But let me tell you some of my other jobs that I have as well. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm even a grandfather. I'm also a son. I'm a brother. And some of those jobs take some work. I am awesome at packing a dishwasher. I can get more plates into a dishwasher and it's a good part of what I do. If you want to come around to my place, one of the things I take pride in is knowing how to cook a steak on a barbecue, only flipping it once. That's very much a part of what I do. But if you come to me and if you ask me, what do I do for work? You're probably not asking me about stacking the dishwasher. You're probably asking me about my paid employment. And that's because the answer I give to that is not just about work. It's about status. It's about self-authentication. Let me illustrate. I've got this good friend. She's still a good friend. Met her about 40 years ago. We were both in the country, finished out of university, and we both started at church at the same time. And I said to her, what do you do for a job? And these were her exact words. She said, I work at the hospital. And so I said to her, are you a nurse? And she paused and she said, no, I'm a doctor. Now, guilty, 101, gender stereotyping, did it straight off. Or was I? Had I devalued her by calling her a nurse? Are nurses less valuable than doctors? Mind you, when she said she was a doctor, all of a sudden my brain thought she got a good HSC result. She's bright. She's capable of earning a lot of money. I boxed her into a category which was a different from a nursing category, and we do it all the time. So work is not just about what we do, but it's actually about how we perceive ourselves and how others perceive us. Now, I want to say to you that Australians are among the hardest working people in the world. We don't admit it because Australians like to put ourselves down, but we are working longer and longer hours. And those of you who are younger than me, if anybody older than you tells you that you're not working hard enough, don't listen to them, because I reckon the younger and the more that we go on, the more addicted we're becoming to work. So what is work? Well, David Miller, in his wonderful book, God and Work, says this: human activity that has both intrinsic and extrinsic value that involves physical and emotional energy. That's what work is. I'll say it again. Human activity that has both intrinsic and extrinsic value that involves physical and emotional energy. But not all work is good work. So let me go to some that's not good work. People in organised crime are working. Sex workers are working. And that's not good work. Secondly, all legal work is not good work. The people who looked after the death camps in Nazi Germany were doing legal work, but few of us would say that it is good. And then, as Mike has said in the introduction, we live in an interesting time where we've got a new category of work that boxes in an unusual way. There's essential workers and non-essential workers. Now, here are some essential workers: doctors, nurses, garbage collectors, and cleaners. They are essential workers. Here are some non-essential workers: barristers, architects, and engineers. Now that kind of turns our status on its head, and it'll be interesting to see what happens when we come out of this COVID environment. So what are the things that define good work? Well, you'll see, if you're filling on your outline there, I've actually got 5 things there that I get this from Dan Doriani. He's got a great book, Work, Its Purpose, Dignity and Transformation. And there are 5 things here that he puts to make good work. Here we go. The first one is that good work fulfills need. So the first one is need. What do we need? Food, clothing, shelter, education, medicine, entertainment. The second thing we see in good work is talent. That we are actually each given talents, and those talents are challenged by our work. So that could be intellectual challenges, it could be problem-solving challenges, it could be physical challenges, but talent is part of that there. Thirdly, there is disciplined effort. Work requires honing of skills. It requires getting good at a task. It requires repetition. Fourthly, work needs direction. Number 4 is direction. We need to have purpose in what we're doing and where we're heading. And then fifthly and finally, work has social approval. We define, and society defines, what is good work. And we listen to that in terms of where society speaks. Not that society always speaks correctly, but it's something to take into account. So 5 things: need, talent, disciplined effort, direction, and correct social appraisal. So all work does matter. But how'd you go on your question? Is there a hierarchy of work? And for some of you, you might be thinking about, you know, should I do job A or should I do job B? Is job A more important than job B? Well, I want to say this. I want to say that all good work is valid and all good work is good. But that doesn't mean that all good work has equal impact. Let me illustrate for you. You're on a plane. Remember when we used to fly on planes? That's right. There are 2 groups of people. There's a team of people in the cockpit, we'll call them the pilots, and there are a team of people who are the flight attendants. Who has more dignity? They have equal dignity. Who is more important? Well, let me ask you the question another way. Mid-flight, which team would you like me to take off the plane? I'm sure you'd quite happily not to have the food service before you land and keep the pilots in the cockpit. The impact of the pilots, and in some ways the importance of their task, is greater than that of the flight attendants. Who's more important in the operating theatre? Is it the surgeon? And so is there a hierarchy, not of dignity, because our dignity ultimately comes from being made in the image of God, but can we ask questions of where would we make a greater impact? And I think that is a valid question. Jesus says in the parable of the talents, everyone to whom much was given, of him much will be required. So it would be hard to argue that David's job as a shepherd had as much impact as David's job as a king. So there is, I think there are hierarchies of work, not in intrinsic value of the individual, but in terms of impact. And we don't want to divide sacred from secular, but what about the gospel? The gospel is something that is proclaimed. It is an announcement of the good news of Jesus. Where does the gospel fit into how we understand the value of our work? Well, I'm going to use a well-known paradigm, and I'm going to work through creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. And I'm going to flesh that out a bit just to see answers to some of these questions. So let's understand why we work and where we find the dignity of work. Firstly, in creation. We start off by seeing in the very beginning of the Bible that God works. Now, it's hard for us to understand how radical a statement this is in the ancient Near East, but it is. If you just study the religions of the ancients, maybe one that you would know a little bit about is the Greeks, the Greek gods on Mount Olympus. All they did all day was laze around and look down at people below them who had to work. The gods do not work in the ancient world. But our God is a God who works. And it's not just that he works in creation, true that is, but he works every day. The fact that the sun came up this morning is clearly shown in Scripture to be God's work. God didn't wind up a clock and just let it run. He is constantly working. And so when God makes us in his image, he makes us to reflect him in the fact that he works. So last Saturday, here's another job I do in my spare time. My daughter and son-in-law bought Sydney's greatest dump. There's no other thing to call it, and they've been renovating it for the last few years. And last Saturday, I went out and I painted the outside of the house for them. I have muscles in my legs I didn't even know existed, and I'm going back this Saturday. By the end of the day, I was exhausted, absolutely exhausted. But I tell you what, I was so satisfied. Have you ever had that sort of day where there is a sanctified exhaustion, an absolute, I'm dead on my feet, but I've had a really good day? If that's the case, that's what you were made for. God works, and you will find your fulfillment in work. But that's not all that God does. God is more than work, and we need to remember that as well if we're made in his image. God is Trinity. So God is made for relationship, and that is at the core of his being. On the seventh day of creation, God rested. And they are two sides of the one coin. And so as we remember that God is a God who works, we need to remember that we can push that a little bit too far as well. If all we are is work, then we actually come into an idolatry that I'll come back to later on, which is called workaholism. But if we don't work, and we're what the Proverbs calls a sluggard, I love that word in the King James Bible, or someone who is lazy, then we don't reflect the character of God. So God is a worker. We are made in his image, and work is good because it emanates from God, and work is not just what you do to get money. It's so much more than that. It's what you do outside of church and even sometimes inside of church. But number two, we come to the fall. Sin impacts God's good creation, and it frustrates our labours. So if you read back in Genesis 3, I'm sure you know the story, that thorns start to infest the ground, and the fall creates misery in work. Now, how does it do that? It does it in a few ways. Firstly, where you work may be a sinful place. It probably is. And maybe at points you are encouraged to share in that sinfulness. So how does that manifest itself? Maybe you work for a selfish landlord who creates misery for other people. Or maybe it's just in how you work. Let's face it, workplaces can be places for gossip, moodiness, blame shifting, seeking the limelight. We can add to that greed, deceit, laziness, selfishness, and a critical spirit, and you've basically got the average workplace somewhere around Sydney. There are plenty of opportunities for open sin in the workplace. But it's not just human sinfulness that the fall causes. The fall also creates a world that is fallen, in which we feel the effects of the fall that are not necessarily the same as sin itself. So, for example, sickness is the result of the fall. When hail comes and destroys the farmer's crop, when rain damages things, or here's a current example, when a virus destroys whole economies. They are all effects of the fall, and they affect our work. And not only is it that at an individual level, but it also works at a systemic level. Our political agendas can be impacted by sin. So we're watching with grief what's happening in the United States at the moment. And I certainly am not going to speak into that politically. I don't have enough knowledge to do so. But on both sides of that dilemma, people are talking about a systemic problem. Maybe our legal system, there are systemic problems. Maybe there are systemic problems of privilege within our society. And so Christians need to recognize that whether it's any of those three categories, whether it's actual sin that's actually happening in the workplace, or whether at an individual level, people feel the effects of the fall, which might be sickness. If someone in your workplace gets sick, that's an effect of the fall, but it doesn't mean that that person sinned. It's an effect of the fall. Or whether, like the Tower of Babel, it actually becomes a systemic thing in society that needs reform. They're the situations in which we're working. So in the light of all of that, there's really no surprise in the fact that the author of Ecclesiastes can see work as something that is meaningless, something that is futile. I mean, really, why bother? It's a good question to ask the atheist. If all of life just ends in death, and we all feel the effects of this systemic fall, of the brokenness of this world, and it's all just going to finish in death, why bother? So they're the first two categories that we need to have carefully in mind. And it doesn't make any sense unless them have them on board. One, creation. And at the point of creation, the central point is this: God works, but it's not all he does. And we need to reflect God in keeping that balance. Secondly, that we live in a world that is broken and in which sin permeates and the effects of sin permeates all that happen. But the Bible talks in Romans chapter 8 about the fact that all of creation is groaning, awaiting its renewal. And so that might be the end of the story for the atheist, but it's not the end of the story for the Christian. And so as we work on from creation through fall, we come to redemption. And this is where I want to really focus a fair bit of our time. Both we'll have a break in a few minutes' time. And then after that as well, I want to keep going on redemption for quite a while. As I set up redemption, let me make some important points to you. Firstly, this is really important. Please don't think it's your job to redeem the world. You're not big enough. It's always God's job to redeem the world. Now, some people will say, and you'll see this pushed too far, that what I'm doing as a doctor, as a lawyer, as a police officer, whatever, is that I am doing my bit to redeem God's world as a Christian worldview. No, the first premise that we need to remember is that that is God's job and he will do it. So central to that is in the Lord's Prayer, where we pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We are not creating heaven on earth. That's God's job. Number two, the second thing we need to remember in light of redemption is this, that the gospel is always that which is proclaimed, and what we proclaim is the fact that Jesus is Lord. We proclaim his death, his resurrection, his life, his coming again. That's always something that is oral and that is proclaimed. Please don't think you are proclaiming the gospel by the way you do your work. I'll come to that in a second, what that is. The way that a dentist does root canal therapy, a Christian dentist doing root canal therapy, is not a proclamation of the gospel. The gospel is good, hear this word, good news. It's an announcement. So number one, to remember that redemption is God's work. Secondly, the gospel is a proclamation. But thirdly, and this is where it comes in, and this is what we're doing. Thirdly, the gospel is a proclamation of the fact that Jesus is king. And so we are actually announcing the kingdom. And the way we do our work actually shows how we understand the kingship of Jesus. He is the one who will redeem, and actually it will impact the way you do root canal therapy. So it's not the gospel, but what it means to be a member of the kingdom. And the Gospels in particular are full of this. And so we show the values of the kingdom that is a kingdom that will redeem the world, for we are awaiting, all creation is groaning, awaiting that which will be revealed, by how we live as citizens of the kingdom. So if you're a doctor, you are actually anticipating a time of healing. If you are a police officer, you are anticipating a time of justice. And you kind of put that together and you think, how do I then live and work in light of the redemption that will be seen in the kingdom? But please don't think it's that simplistic. Please don't think that doctors are only concerned for healing. Because let me tell you, doctors need to be concerned for justice. And please don't think that when a police officer turns up at a motor vehicle accident, that she is not concerned for healing. We're much more, much less compartmentalized than that. And then our God is a God of creativity. Maybe some of you work in the creative arts, and that again reflects the creation and the fall and the redemption of all things. Someone who's concerned for the environment, an environmental scientist or I don't know, a park ranger in a national park. What's that person concerned for? Well, justice, healing, order, creativity. It's all part of what we're concerned for. And so we see in the Bible that the God who works has created people in his image to very much be his hands and his feet in the world, to actually be the ones who work reflecting the values of God in the world. Now, let me qualify that again, because that expression has been so abused over the years. I've heard sermons where people have said, God has no hands except your hands, so you should do his work. Now, that's terrible. Please don't think that God needs you. God certainly doesn't need us, but he does choose to use us. So it's not as though he has no hands except ours, no, but we are his hands. And we are there reflecting the character of God and the character of his kingdom. So as we go soon to a break, I want you to think about how we understand our work as an expression of the Creator God in his image, how we impact fallenness. Maybe your job is directly about fallenness. Maybe you are a dentist. There would be no dentist without a fall because there wouldn't be any tooth decay. Or maybe you're a lawyer, or maybe you're directly dealing with impacts of the fall, but somehow the fall impacts it. And then how we understand what we do as part of God's redeeming work. Because Job says this. Job, at the end of towards the end of chapter 9, he says, why bother? This has been such a waste of time because it's all going to go in suffering. Maybe like Solomon in Ecclesiastes, you might just say, meaningless, meaningless, meaningless is everything under the sun. And really, if death is all there is to look forward to, death makes a mockery of work. I don't know how many works there are that have not been completed because of the great enemy of death that makes mockery of all the things that we do. But the Christian says, as Paul says at the end of 1 Corinthians 15, that our labour in the Lord is not in vain, which means that the resurrection changes everything. And we're going to come back from a break and we're going to continue on looking at how we understand that whole redemptive attitude of work, and actually how do we decide what is more valid work than other work. So we'll come back to that afterwards, Mike. I think that's about time for a break.
So we're going to have a 3-minute break. So as you do so those people who have joined, just another reminder, we have the Slido app. So if you do have any questions as you're reflecting on this topic, please do send it through. We'll go through this in our Q&A session. But we'll meet at 8:15 again. We'll take a break. Please be on time. 3 minutes. Okay, so it's 8:15. Thanks for being on time, guys. I can't see you on screen, but I trust that you're sitting down and ready to go. So Ian, back to you, please.
Okay. So I've got a question for you. How's your break? That's good. Here's the question. What do you do for a job? If you've got someone else in the room, just answer the question. What do you do for a job? Okay. I'll tell you a story. It's not a true story. I go up to 3 people in my local Woolworths, and they all work at the checkout at Woolworths. And I say exactly the same thing to them. What do you do for a job? Person number 1 says this. I scan items, I collect money, and assist customers. True? True. Number 2 says this: I provide income for my family. True? True. Here's number 3. I'm an essential worker and I allow people to eat, clean, and live in modern society. Now, which one of those is a correct answer to the question? You see, you might have given the answer, I'm an engineer, but that's really only one facet of how you understand work. You might have given the answer, I provide for my family. You might have said, this is the effect of what I do, which is how the third person answered. So one of the things I want to ask you, as we keep looking at the respective value of work, is not just the first answer, which is that I scan items at the checkout, but I want you to start thinking about the third answer of the impact of what I do. The impact of what I do as an essential worker is I provide food and cleaning materials, etc. So if I was to ask you that question, we might get a different answer. And that's going to come down to the level of motivation. What motivates you in your job? See, let's go back to the 19th century. And I'm living in Britain, and I'm telling people that I'm going out to India to help in the colonies. Now, let me tell you, back in the 19th century, that would have been seen as incredibly noble. But in the 21st century, we would probably see it as condescending, as imperialistic, and stinks of colonialism. So the way we see the impact of what we do is often governed by where we are in history and our different social factors that are working there. So here's a question. If work is redemptive, and if it is a reflection of the kingdom of God, is there a biblical benchmark for what makes for moral work? And I think there is. There's many, but here's just one I've chosen. We, in Reformed Christianity, talk about the 10 Commandments as the moral law of God. And I want to just look quickly at the 10 Commandments and to go through them in different categories and to show how they speak into morality and to show how they speak into a hierarchy of redemptive impact in terms of what we do. So firstly, when we come to the 10 Commandments, they start in the context of redemption. This is how they start. Exodus 20 verse 2, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Redemption. Okay, if we think about the first 3 commandments, the first 3 commandments are all about not worshipping other gods, not making idols, and bringing glory to God's name. Now, how does your work fit into the category of bringing glory to God and not making an idol? Well, here's a question we often ask, and people probably asked you when you were younger. This is what we ask young kids. What are you going to be when you grow up? Now, I want you to think about that question. We don't ask young kids, what are you going to do when you grow up? We ask them, what are you going to be when you grow up? Because we think, for the reasons that when I asked that doctor what she did for a job, because we think that what we do for a job will define who we are. And so my guess is that you have already sacrificed many, many hours and much money and a lot of effort on the altar of self-actualization that is often called education. Now, that can be a good thing, but it also can be a bad thing. There is always the danger of idolatry. As I already said, Australians put themselves down, but we are an incredibly workaholic nation. Business Insider, this is quite a few years ago now, did a survey around the world with different criteria about how people are ranked in terms of workaholism. Do you know where Australia came? Second. What was the only country that beat us? Japan. But all the other countries that work, doesn't mean we're working harder, but here are some of the criteria that they use. How much annual leave do people take each year? In that survey, it was found that 47% of Australians, that's nearly half of Australians, do not use up all their annual leave each year. Why is that? Most Australians work beyond the hours that are required. We think it's wonderful because in an age of technology, we can work wherever we want. The reality of that means we never stop working. Our home has ceased to become a place of refuge and respite and has actually become an alternate office. And so within those first three commandments of worshipping no other gods, not making idols, and only bringing glory to God's name, the redemptive characteristic of work has got a lot to say. The fourth commandment, which ties into that, is the command about Sabbath. The flip side of work is rest. And as we've already seen, when we look at the character of God, God doesn't only work, he also rests. And so when we are in a situation of thinking that our work is self-actualization, we are terrified to stop working because we will cease to be that person that we want to be. Because when we were young, our grandparents and aunts and our parents' friends said to us, what do you want to be when you grow up? And the problem is you never really properly grow up. You're always becoming. See, I don't know, I know a lot of you come from a Korean background. I come from a British background. I'll tell you how it works in British society. I'm sure it's the same in Korean society. You were born into an occupation. My surname is an occupation. A smith is somebody who deals with metal, blacksmiths. Although my father always used to tell me that we were related to goldsmiths, which sounds much more exotic. But if you think about some of the surnames out there, baker, tailor, farmer, smith, because what you were born is what you did for a job. It's a bit like Prince William. Prince William has never needed to go to careers advice because he knows what he's going to do for the rest of his life. He's born a prince. So in a traditional society, you didn't work in order to become. You just worked in that environment in which you were born. And there is a plus in that. The other great thing about traditional societies back at the time of the 10 Commandments is they had no electricity. Electricity is such a bane for us because when the sun went down, you could no longer work. And so work actually has a rhythm. There is a daily rhythm when the sun goes down. There's a weekly rhythm called Sabbath. There are festivals in annual rhythm. And so we see that rest is the other side of work. So do you find rest in your work? Do you find rest from your work? How do you understand that? And we perpetuate that with our kids so that our kids will be whatever we want them to be. We send them to the best school. We give them after school coaching. We absolutely exhaust them. And to pay for all of that, we absolutely exhaust ourselves trying to pay for all of that. And we just never get off this treadmill. The fourth commandment's about Sabbath. The fifth commandment is really interesting in working out. These are all given in the context of redemption. It's about honouring your father and your mother. Now, of course, that starts with parental authority, but it's not just parental authority. Parental authority is just the first authority, but how much do you respect appropriate authority? There's two sorts of people. I'm sure there's two sorts of people at Sydney Living Hope. They're probably at every church. And that's because we are created and we are sinful. There are plenty of people who do just what mum and dad want them to do. Now that can be good and that can be bad. That can be a form of idolatry, sacrificing our life on that altar. Or it can be just a good way of keeping the commandments. And I'm sure there's plenty of people at Sydney Living Hope who actually choose to do a career because that's what mum and dad don't want them to do. And so they're just actually out to prove that I'm actually not going to do what my parents tell me to do. And let me tell you, that can be just as much of an altar, and that can be just as much of an idol. We need to think carefully about whether our parents are motivated by good priorities. We need to think about whether we will allow other people to speak into our lives. Sometimes we do work for our parents' approval for the right reasons and sometimes for the wrong reasons. Sometimes we try to prove our parents wrong for the right reasons, for the wrong reasons. But it needs wisdom in terms of redemption. And I know it's a big issue in many churches with younger people. And so I raise it there because God raises it. The sixth commandment talks about how work works as redemption. The sixth commandment is don't murder. Now that's a really big issue if you work in medicine. It's a massive issue. But it's not only a big issue in medicine, it's a really big issue if you work in building compliance. If you're an Uber driver, if you work in terms of, if you're an engineer, a structural engineer on Opal Towers or some other site around Sydney, if you're a soldier, if you're a parent looking after small kids, or maybe you're an adult child looking after elderly parents. Do not murder is a really important redemptive characteristic of the kingdom as we seek to live out kingdom values. Look at 7 to 9. Commandment number 7 is don't commit adultery. And we live in an incredibly sexualized world. Maybe if you work in areas of marketing or advertising, that's going to be a really big thing for you in workplace relations, in counselling. But of course, adultery is not just about sexual ethics, but adultery is also about keeping your word. And so it goes to areas like duplicity and lying. And so that leads on to the next commandment, 2 commandments, which are about stealing and bearing false witness. So it goes to cheating, whether in sexual ways, but also cheating in order to secure a sale, or maybe cheating to pass an exam. They are reflections of kingdom values in commandments 7 through 9. And then the last of this, remember, these are the criteria, these are the benchmarks of what it means to be redemptive in our workplace, goes to coveting. And another word for coveting is greed. And the mighty dollar is very pervasive. But it's interesting, I mean, we are concerned for how much we're paid in the workplace, but I actually don't think that's the highest motivator. Quite often, we want to be paid in reputation, in appreciation, in being noticed. They all go to things that we covet and things for which we are greedy. And yet the Apostle Paul can say, godliness with contentment is great gain. So all of these things, all of the 10 commandments are actually expressing what it means to be redemptive in the workplace and in the rest of our lives in terms of living for God's glory as members of God's kingdom who has redeemed us out of the slavery of Egypt. Well, can I summarize all of that down? Well, I'm not going to bother because it's been done for us in the New Testament. And if you think about it in Matthew 22, how do you summarize the whole law? Well, it's really simple. It goes to this: love God and love your neighbor. It actually comes down to living in kingdom values, comes down to the impact of love. Now, going back to those supermarket people, the first one just talked in terms of function. That's what that person does. I just scan items and collect money. But the second two, I actually think gave better answers. The second person talked about the utilitarian impact of what they do, and that is to provide for my family. That's a really important, loving thing about work. But the third thing actually looked at the impact of the job in terms of love to enable people to have food to eat and things to clean their houses with. And it's interesting that as we've come down to essential workers during COVID-19, we haven't been asking about the task. We've actually been asking about the impact. And I think what the Bible says is that love is an ultimate impact, and we need to value the importance of what we do in terms of love. So, of course, love is not about being nice to people. I mean, the Christian manager sometimes needs to exercise love for the whole of the company by sacking somebody, and that's the most loving thing to do. Sometimes the corporate group outvalues the individual. And even, let's go back to our dentist. I mean, how does a dentist love people? Well, here's two ways to love people. The first way is, as a dentist, I could say I'm going to love people by lowering my fees to give affordable dental care to as many people as possible. Is that loving? Well, here's what the second dentist says. The second dentist says, I'm going to actually have high fees so that I can have state-of-the-art dental equipment so I can offer high quality and not compromised dental care. Which one of those is more loving? Well, that's an interesting question. But the interesting question is, and here's the question I'm encouraging you to ask. The dentist is not asking questions about status. The dentist is not asking questions about, does what I do reflect the fact I got a higher HSC mark or whatever? The dentist is asking a question, and they're the right questions, they're both good answers, of the impact of love that is the summary of the law by what I do in terms of the hierarchy of what I do. You see, if you think about Jesus, Jesus went around proclaiming the gospel, and that's really important, highly, ultimate importance. But Jesus also did lots of healings to demonstrate the value of the kingdom. Did Jesus heal just so that people would listen to his proclamation of the gospel? And the answer is no. Actually, that's manipulating people. That's just utilitarianism. If you read through the Gospels, particularly the Gospel of Mark, Jesus does a miracle, and what's the first thing he does? He disappears. He retreats, he retreats, he retreats. Sometimes Jesus looks on people. You think about this with a Syrophoenician woman, a classic example. And why does Jesus heal her? Because he had compassion. Because he demonstrated the character of God's love that actually is a demonstration of the values of the kingdom. Now, there's a strange irony in this. If you love people without any agenda, they will listen to you. But if you love people so that they will listen to you, they will read that as self-serving and they won't listen to you. So it's a strange agenda, but it's also true. An outworking of a God who is a creator is that I work. The fact that it is a fallen world means there is actual sin, the effects of sin, and systemic sin. In the fact that God will be redeeming the world means I need to proclaim the gospel that people might know the way of salvation, absolutely. And we all proclaim the gospel, okay, in different ways. But whether you're a minister or whether you're a dentist or whether you are working at Woolworths, you actually need to be thinking of the category of love. Justice serves love. The 10 Commandments can be summarized by love, and how this work is showing the impact of love in terms of how we serve God's society in a redemptive way. Not that we will redeem the world, but we are members of the kingdom, and the king will redeem the world. And so then we go to the last of the categories, which is restoration. And we don't just finish with redemption, but the Christian hope looks forward to a time of new heavens and new earth in which righteousness reigns. And so as we look forward to the new heavens and the new earth, so that informs the way we do our work. Now, when we look at the new heavens and the new earth, and we come to the end of the Bible, we're actually introduced to two cities, and that becomes really helpful for us. The first city that we're introduced to is the city of Babylon. And we read in Revelation 18, verse 4, that it says, "Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins." Should you work in Babylon, in light of the fact that Babylon will be destroyed? Here's the problem. My guess is most of you work in Babylon. I remember talking to a Christian just a couple of years ago when the plebiscite was happening on same-sex marriage. And this Christian was having a real crisis because she worked for Qantas. And Qantas, of course, was all into marriage equality, and she was terrified to tell people she was a Christian at work. What advice do you give? Do you say go and join a convent and disappear from the workplace? Well, clearly not. I mean, after all, Daniel is a prime example. Daniel worked in Babylon and he became prime minister of Babylon. Joseph served in Pharaoh's court. But with both of those men, it cost them dearly because they had integrity. Daniel ended up in a den of lions and Joseph ended up in prison. Can a Christian work in the area of family law as a lawyer? Can a Christian be an obstetrician and gynecologist? Can a Christian be a parliamentarian? And the answer is absolutely. We definitely need people to be working in Babylon. But if you find yourself working in Babylon, and my guess is if you're in the workforce, you're already working in Babylon, here are the questions that you need to ask yourself. Am I serving God in this situation? Am I loving people as God's hand in the world? Or am I just conforming to ungodly behavior? If I'm just conforming, come out of Babylon. Secondly, you should be asking yourself up front, where are the potential conflicts which I will have working in this environment as a Christian? Prepare yourself for what it's going to be like. Thirdly, ask yourself, what is it that motivates me to do this? And fourthly, put around yourself accountability. So as we look to the new heavens and the new earth, there's one city that is Babylon, and we are told to come out of Babylon. And that doesn't mean we go into a monastery, but we recognize that we are different, as Daniel was in Babylon, as Joseph was in Egypt. But the other city that we see is the New Jerusalem. And we see that in Revelation 21 and 22. And that's the picture of a garden in the city. And that's a magnificent picture because gardens are the handiwork of God, but cities are the handiwork of people. And we actually come to a picture at the end of the Bible where we see God's works and people's works kind of all come together. Even a garden, it's God who waters the garden, but humans are out there involved in it. How much, here's the question for you, two questions we think about restoration. How much am I in Babylon? I've got to come out of that. Number two, how much synergy is there in my work, of my work and God's work? I mean, if you're a doctor, who heals? You, the antibiotics, or God? And the answer is yes. Ultimately, God is the one who heals, but I'm actually seen as an extension of what God is doing in his world. And so it's a really simple paradigm of asking myself, how does what I do in justice, in righteousness, in order, in creativity, in healing, in all those areas, reflect the values of the kingdom and what it will be? And so here are the questions I ask myself as we kind of wrap up. I ask myself, and I'm trying to work out work, I ask myself, how has God gifted me? He's given me talents, he's given me education, he's given me family background. I want to make an impact, and I want to make the greatest impact, but I've got to do it wisely. Secondly, God has given me his spirit. And so can I discern myself properly to know what I'm good at? Thirdly, God has put wise people around me. My parents might be one of them. People at church might be some of them, to speak into my life. Fourthly, God provides for us opportunities to develop our gifts and skills and hone them. What opportunities he's given you? And fifthly, and most importantly, in discerning the way of love, God has given to us wisdom. You see, let me ask you just a simple question to close off with. Which job has more impact? The CEO of an organisation or the janitor? Well, normally the CEO. But it depends how I define impact. You see, if I'm someone who doesn't cope very well with stress, and I'm the CEO, and I go home stressed out, and I take out all my frustrations on my family, I'm not an effective husband, I'm not a loving father, is that the best job to create the greatest impact? Maybe a better job for me is to be the janitor, and I will create greater impact. And part of that is having understanding our wisdom, our giftedness, our makeup, allowing people to speak into our lives. And so in the light of how God has made us as working people in a fallen world that God is redeeming, anticipating the new heavens and the new earth, so I pray for wisdom as I seek appropriate work and as I'm motivated by love in how God would use me. So that's kind of a few thoughts I've got. Bring it all together. I might flick back to you, Mike, and you can pick it up from there.